Welcome to this evening's installment of the National Humanities Center's Virtual Book Club. I'm Robert Newman, President and Director of the Center, and your host for this evening's event. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for the last of 6 installments in what has been a fascinating series of conversations. If you missed any of our previous events this spring, I encourage you to go to the events page on the Center's website, nationalhumanities.center.org, to watch them. I also want to thank our distribution partners for this virtual book club series, the Leadership Council of Aging Organizations, the Furman Humanities Center, WFAE Radio, and Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes at Arizona State University, Duke University, Furman University, North Carolina State University, the University of Alabama, and the University of Michigan. Thank you. I want to begin this evening's session, as I've begun all sessions, with a poem. And I want to invoke the wonderful nature poet Mary Oliver and her poem entitled Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Before I introduce this evening's guest, I want to point out that while you'll only be able to hear our voices tonight, we can all participate in the conversation using the comments section. And I encourage you to pose your questions to our speakers there and to offer your thoughts at any time. I'll be monitoring that part of our conversation, and we'll get to those questions later in the hour. Now, let me share a little bit about our guests. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She has published 6 books, including The Heavingses of Monticello, An American Family, which won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award for Nonfiction. In recognition of her considerable achievements, Professor Gordon-Reed received the National Humanities Medal and a MacArthur Fellowship in 2010, and she was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011. Since 2018, she has served as a trustee of the National Humanities Center. Peter S. Onuf is the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Virginia and a Senior Research Fellow at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He was one of the founding co-hosts of the public radio program Backstory with the American History Guys, and he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2014. Peter has published a dozen books, including several that explore Thomas Jefferson's political thought, among them Jefferson's Empire, The Language of American Nationhood, and The Mind of Thomas Jefferson. In 2016, Peter and Annette co-authored the book they're going to discuss with us this evening, Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination. And it's my pleasure to welcome the two of them this evening, Peter and Annette.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here and to be here, at least virtually, with my good friend and co-author, Annette Gordon-Reed. And we thought we'd start tonight just about talking about our collaboration for a few minutes before we dive with you into the heart and soul of Thomas Jefferson, our subject. And maybe a good place to begin would be to talk about the title of the book, and then why did we do it in the first place? Maybe that's the best.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do we do this thing?
Well, I know why I did it. And then
why did you do it?
Well, I did it because you asked me if I would do it. And the reason, and you disclosed this in strictest confidence, but I'll share it with our audience tonight, that you were afraid as an old guy going out to pasture that I wouldn't do anything anymore. And this was a humane gesture of keeping me in the field, so to speak, as opposed to the pasture. So that this collaboration, and to be less flippant, though I take that because this has been a wonderful experience for me. But the idea of writing a biography of Jefferson was not something that would have come to mind. I don't think of myself as a biographer. Why did you think?
Well, I mean, I know that you have a range. I figured that you would have a range and we could do this together. No, those things were true. You were retiring, and I thought that, you should have something to do, that you shouldn't just go out to pasture. And so I thought that this would be preparation for me to do a bigger biography of Jefferson, which I intend to do. And you write about the intellectual side of Jefferson. I've read parts of that myself, and I do more the private life, social parts of Jefferson's life and politics, and you do some of that as well. It seemed to me a good thing to have two people who've looked at this subject from different perspectives come together and collaborate. And so that's why we decided to do it. And we cast about for a title. I mean, titles are always tough, and that's always the thing that
Thomas
I
Jefferson.
think of.
A new
Thomas
life.
Jefferson, a new life, one of for the 20,000th time. No, we wanted to do a book about Jefferson that would be different. I mean, it's almost like a rote recitation to talk about how inscrutable he is, that you can't really know him, and that he doesn't make any sense. And you always talk about him in terms of contradictions. And we thought that he was a pretty coherent person, that he had a coherent philosophy. If you paid attention to chronology, if you didn't take something that happened in 1787 as a justification for something he said in 1820, if you really followed along closely, you could figure this person out. And we cast about for titles. And I think it was Peter who suggested initially that we take a phrase from a letter that he wrote to Angelica Church after he is retiring from Washington's cabinet, and he's going home to Monticello to lick his wounds and take his marbles and go home after having been bested in the cabinet battles by Alexander Hamilton. And he writes to her and he's telling her what he's going to do. And then he talks about having his fields to form and to watch for the happiness of those who labor for mine, that is to say, enslaved people. And he says, my daughters are near me and I'm going back to my farm. And if everything works out the way I expect it to do, I will consider myself to be as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And Peter thought that is a very picturesque kind of way to put it, most blessed of the patriarchs. Here's a guy who's seen as the apostle of liberty, who is forward thinking, who is, all for science and progress. And he's talking about himself in these terms of some ancient figure. And we thought, what's that all about? And that was sort of an invitation to begin to think about the inner life of Jefferson, to try to put him together, the public and the private, to come up with a coherent portrait of him. And so that's what we wanted to do. I mean, our editor did not, and our publishers were not thrilled by the idea of patriarch, because they thought it would immediately conjure up, as I said, something ancient. And I didn't like the fact that they didn't want to put quotation marks. They didn't want it to be a Jefferson quote. They said, you don't put quotations on the cover of books. At the same time, I didn't want to be seen saying Jefferson was the most blessed of the patriarchs. That's not me saying that, an African-American woman, or Peter, the liberal New England guy. We're not going to say most blessed of the patriarchs. That's who this person is. That's what he described himself. And so we wanted to think, what did he mean by that? And why was that important for him to say? So that's how we came up with this somewhat unusual title, something that a self-description of a person that gave us a way into thinking about him.
Yeah, before we talk more about patriarchy and why that antique or archaic word works for us, why do you think it took us to write the really great biography? Just joking. Why those other 19,000 people have written about Jefferson?
Why they were wrong?
Yeah, why they're all wrong. I mean, what is it? I mean, it's a serious question. That is, why do people call him inscrutable? What is it? Almost seems perversely willful for somebody who leaves thousands and thousands of letters. We know a lot about this guy.
We know a lot about him, and well, for a biographer, you have to realize that we're never going to really know 100% the whole person, but you can kind of get there. You can get a coherent understanding of who this person was. I think people enjoy it. You know, I think people enjoy presenting him as this mystery. You know, we don't. It's like, you know, it's like conspiracy theories. Why do people think that 19,000 people could keep a secret? You know, it's like, no, it doesn't work. You can't, there's not some, magic thing that's happening here. And I think they like to see him that way because we do the paradox thing. On one hand, he owned slaves, and on the other hand, he wrote the Declaration of Independence and blah, 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 as if people don't have warring ideas that all of us, we have intellectual beliefs that don't coincide with what we do all the time. I mean, life would be very, very different if everybody did what they knew to be right, but we don't. And the question is, why don't they? What are the kinds of forces, that competing forces are they contending with, that make them not as coherent or seem to be hypocritical? And so I think there's a certain pleasure in that. For the same reason people keep giving Sally Hemings, new fathers to her children, because it's a mystery that people don't want to let go of. And they can't just go with what makes the most sense, what the evidence suggests. It has to be, oh, I want to argue about this some more. I got a letter today from somebody, who was doing that kind of thing. It's like, why? But you don't want to let go of that because you don't want to let go of the story of Jefferson as this mystery man.
Well, it's not just a mystery. I don't know if I think that's a lot of the answer, but it's also that people expect so much of him and they expect different things. So that's the very idea that he's a Renaissance man. He does everything, but he can be the hero to George Will, the man of the millennium. He can be a hero to radical Democrats. He seems elusive, and the default word that just inevitably comes up with the author of the Declaration of Independence, who owns slaves, is he's just got to be a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And so,
and remember, that's one of the things we said. We wanted to banish that. We want that word out of here because it's born of an expectation of a person, that expectations that are just too high. They don't make any sense in the context of thinking about an individual, actual person, not a demigod, an actual Homo sapien.
Yeah. So let's warn our listeners, our auditors, well, they're watching us, I guess, that they may not ask questions about hypocrisy. Otherwise, we're fair game for everything. Well, let's talk about patriarchy for a little bit. It is a strange term, but what it signals, I think, for us is that a good, coherent answer or picture of Jefferson has to begin at home. He's referring to his family, of course, as a patriarch. He's referring to his place. He's escaping, as you suggested, from the torment of politics into the loving bosom of his family. And it's there, I think, that we really have begun to uncover what Jefferson's all about. He tells us that family is important. Is family just an escape from the hurly-burly of the world? Is he really just a very private man? Does that make any sense for a person who, how many years was he in his public career?
Oh, a huge amount. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
from his 20s, you know, if you start with the Burgesses and all of those kinds of things, the local
Right.
involvement. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough, must have been a tough thing for him, but it was also something that he actually needed. I mean, on one hand, he's thinking, as you suggest, that the family is a refuge, but he has this desire, ambition to be a person, a figure in the world, a person who moves and shakes things. And we talk a little bit about in the book about what is really preoccupying Jefferson so much is the revolution. That was the creation of the United States of America is what obsessed him. I mean, he wasn't obsessed with race. He wasn't obsessed with slavery. He wasn't obsessed with, you know, the status of women. He was obsessed with the idea of this country that he had helped to create and the vanquishing of monarchy. So on one hand, he has this place that he loves to be, but he recognizes himself as a figure on the world stage, and he can't let go of that. I mean, certainly after the Declaration, after the revolution, he's not going to let go of public life. There's no question that he loved to be at Monticello, and he loved his family being in that setting. But he was a man of, he thought of destiny, and he wasn't going to walk away from that.
So what did he think the revolution was going to do for him, for his family, for Virginia, for the world? Let me just offer a deflationary comment about the revolution. It was a familiar thing for Americans. It was a tax revolt.
It was a tax revolt.
Yeah, and who were these people who were revolting against taxation? Well, they were colonizers. They were building colonies. They were building plantations. They were exploiting enslaved people. They were pressing Indians into the backcountry. And they were producing goods for European markets. And it was, as Benjamin Franklin said, the best poor man's country in the world. It was what a great place to be. So what was it that a provincial person, and let's face it, Thomas Jefferson comes from back of nowhere. He is a knockoff Briton on the wrong side of the ocean. He's tremendously ambitious. He's got great aspirations. What does he think the revolution is going to do?
Well, it's going to transform the world. I mean, he was the person, if you think about American exceptionalism, he may have been the first person to articulate that idea of America as a place that would be a beacon to the world. And you're right, it's sort of a strange thing to think if you look around and you see a person who's in a wilderness, a person who is a part of a society that is enslaving people and involved in this, contentious relations with indigenous people. But I think he thought America was the beginning of something, that this was an Enlightenment project. And that's something that we kind of don't take seriously today, as seriously as he did, but he was enthusiastic about that. And he thought that this was a step in progress. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something. And so he could be quite idealistic about something that we look at now and say, wait a minute, but what about this? What about this carnage around you?
That might be a good thing to talk about for just a minute. You mentioned monarchy as the great problem, is that the Declaration of Independence is an indictment, a bill of indictment against George III. A lot of disappointment. You let us down, George. You were not the good king, the patriot king we imagined you to be, because a good British monarch is supposedly the super patriot, and he it's rule of law, and people are able to carry on in their lives. But Jefferson is obsessed with unearned, privileged power, aristocracy, monarchy, domination of the well-born. Because by definition, nobody in Anglo-America is well-born. They're middling people.
Well, they thought they were.
Yeah, Especially in Virginia, they take their first families very seriously.
Yeah, they thought they were aristocrats of a sort.
Yeah.
But I know, I get your point, but I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at, and the big point, and I like to use the image of social order is vertical, and in a hierarchical society with the king at the top and the various social orders taking you down to the humblest and the lowest. That's a conception of society that's built on an order, a hierarchical order. Jefferson is a Republican with a small r. It doesn't mean he's not enlightened and ambitious. He's very hardworking, but he believes in the idea that all, and this I think where the word patriarch comes in, all the fathers of all the families should meet each other on the basis of equality. This is the great insight of the revolutionary generation, is that we don't have to have that order. We don't need hierarchy. We can have that natural attraction to each other. Society, as Thomas Paine said, is natural to people. Government is artificial. And this idea of a society that's liberated from monarchy and aristocracy, it's a compelling and powerful idea. It's what we now call democracy, though we don't know what it is. But that idea that somehow it's ours, we own it, and we're part of it. In a way, sovereignty is us. Yeah. We don't defer to a sovereign.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that seems for us, as you were suggesting, so, well, either banal, obvious, or it doesn't mean anything.
Well, of course it would be, because, with kings and queens and all of that kind of stuff, we like to watch Downton Abbey and all those kinds of things, almost like a fairy tale, Princess Diana or whatever. But we don't really take monarchy seriously as a form. But for him, I mean, to have grown up in a monarchy, to be in a world where monarchy was the order of the day, to vanquish that, to get rid of that was a big deal. And you're right, we don't take that seriously. Who would have thought that kings were serious? But they were serious. And to have a different form of government, a republic that was supposed to be based upon destroying that kind of an aristocratic hierarchy, was something that he thought was an achievement. He made a big deal of it. Now we can see all the ways that it was limited. I mean, there was a discussion a month or so ago that I had with people on Twitter about what would be different if we were to talk about what was created was not a republic, but an aristocracy of white men. How would history be written if we thought of it in those terms? Because what we're really doing is freeing up, get rid of the Brits, and we free up the country to be run by white guys, by white men. And without, obviously, enslaved people would not be a part of that, and women wouldn't be a part of that. But we think about that differently if you change the name of what it was that was created. But for him, he wouldn't have questioned the notion of male rule, obviously. That would have been natural. Yeah. That was a given. And enslaved people, that's a tough question. They had to go somewhere else and have their country and meet, there we could meet on some sort of plane of equality, but he never had a solution to that. But we look at this, and I think rightfully so. Obviously, we don't just accept everything that he says about all of this, but for him, this was a big achievement. It was a signal achievement, and that was his obsession. For the rest of his life. What are we going to do about the United States? How do we preserve the United States of America? And those questions about slavery, all those things, they will work themselves out in the fullness of time. And of course, we know that's not what happened, but that was his expectation.
Well, no, Jefferson didn't think that Virginia was a perfect commonwealth. Get rid of the king and Virginians are just fine.
No.
How would you describe old regime Virginia?
You describe old regime.
You think I should
you describe old regime?
Well,
yes, I think you should.
All right. Well, I'll start.
I'm getting into trouble enough here, making all these pronouncements. You get into some trouble.
No, you're doing beautifully. I love it. Well, old regime. That's an interesting way to put it. Old regime. because of course, Jefferson would tell you the old regime's on the other side of the ocean.
Yeah.
That's where monarchy lives. That's where aristocracy flourishes. But Jefferson actually is deeply upset with provincial Virginia. He's concerned about its imperfections. It is a backwater province. It's not characterized by a lot of enlightened farmers. It is a slave society. He knows this. He's concerned about, when he talks about slavery, for instance, he's concerned about what young planters' children learn by watching slavery being performed. He says, this is a world of petty despots, of tyrants, of people who learn mastery, and mastery is a way of life. These are people who have wonderful opportunities because this is a rich and prosperous land, but we're squandering it in speculation and there's so many corrupt things about Virginia. Everybody wants to be to get some advantage, or to be connected with the crown, to get land grants. It's a sordid scramble for wealth and advantage. Mm-hmm. So it's, in many ways, Jefferson, I think, is dissatisfied with his own class, or his misgivings about his own class, and he invests a tremendous amount in ordinary white farmers. I like to say that Jefferson has Pennsylvania envy. He looks north of the Mason-Dixon line. He sees family farms that produce food, not tobacco. It's wheat. And it's that kind of wholesome society. This is what America could be. And that's one of the reasons why he fantasizes about Virginia without slavery.
Pennsylvania envy, New England envy, places where, and I think even Malone, his great biographer, said that one of the things that he liked about being in France was that he could sort of live the life that he lived, with servants, with people without slavery. So he's fantasizing, and in fantasizing again, of doing without slavery, he's also fantasizing doing without Black people, obviously, because slavery was racially based. He's dissatisfied with Virginia, and even after the revolution, he wonders whether or not they're up to things. We began our book in the start of the book is talking about his response to a letter that his granddaughter Ellen writes when she travels up to Massachusetts to be with her husband. She's married a man from New England, and she's talking about, my God, they have nice roads. There are these wonderful inns that you can stop in, and they're all clean. There are schools, these tidy villages, all this kind of stuff. And look at what we have in Virginia, essentially. And she identifies slavery as the reason why the society is backwards. And he says, yes, that's what it is. If things had been different, we could have societies like that as well. So it's, he understands that there are these things that he wants to do, but at the same time, he is insecure about the capacity of his people, his people, that is to say Virginians, his countrymen, to actually pull this off. And then this plays into the university and all the things that he hopes to have happen with that. But that ambition is there, but he's born in a place where the people around him, to him, don't seem to be, it's not clear that they're up to snuff.
And that's clear to him before he goes to France. It's in those years when he's in Virginia, when he's the governor, he's in the assembly, when in 1779 he drafts a comprehensive revisal of the laws. This is the great reform moment for Jefferson, getting rid of aristocratic privilege, entail and primogeniture, establishing an education system as one of his dreams. Root out aristocracy, educate the people. We'll have a popular democratic enlightenment. And that's a radical idea, because the Enlightenment is not a popular movement. It doesn't come from below. It comes from the aristocrats and from the privileged.
from the elite.
Yeah. So there's a lot that he'd like to have done in Virginia, because this is as if it were clay that could be molded into a perfect vessel, a perfect commonwealth. But he goes to Paris. And I think this is in some ways the major pivot of our understanding of Jefferson is, what does America look like to Jefferson when he looks back across the ocean? And we remember that he's the frustrated reformer when he's in Virginia. He's has a disastrous gubernatorial career. He's facing an investigation by the Virginia legislature, looking into his performance. Virginia proves to be a frail reed when the British invade, and there's no there. Where is all that? Where is that patriotic people? Where is the great strength of the Republic? There's nothing. It's not there. Mm-hmm. What happens? Why do things look so different to him when he gets to Paris?
Well, there are lots of conflicting things. On one hand, one thing that looks different, I mean, he is impressed obviously by the sophistication of the society, the music, the architecture, all those kinds of things. But at the same time, that sophistication repels him because he begins to see families, the form of the family in France frightens him, to wit, women out in the streets, as he says, going around talking politics, being involved in all kinds of things. And he's frightened by that. It's a real, he likes the culture, the as I said, art, music, all those kinds of things. But he begins to look back at it and he says, we have good things in Virginia too. We have family. We may not have high art. We may not play music as well as they do, classical music and so forth, but our families are wholesome. And that's what he begins to think about, the sort of, he sees them as decadent. This is, and it is sort of, this is pre-revolutionary France. It doesn't get as out there, more out there than it was then in terms of, people having affairs, all kinds of things. So he begins to see some good things in Virginia that he might be able to work with.
He's anxious, he's frightened. He's frightened of what? That he will lose his virtue?
Yes, that he would lose his virtue, that young men coming, what are you going to do? Leave the young men out of don't let them come to France, because their heads will be turned around and they'll, turn into wastrels or whatever. So it's not an untypical kind of thing when people see themselves as inferior in a way, intimidated. They said, well, we may not have all those things, but we have spirit. We have the natural, we're naturally good people. And so it reinforces, he's mad at Virginia when he goes over, but when he looks back from France, he's saying, it's not so bad. We have some good things to build on. And, it changes his attitude about slavery. It changes lots of things.
So why does it change his attitude about slavery?
Well, he begins to, instead of being a person who, while he's there, he starts thinking of a lot of schemes to end slavery, bringing Germans over and mixing them with enslaved people, and then they all become great citizens at the end. Doesn't ever follow up on that. But he says, France has lived all this long time, and they've had this problem with peasants, people who are starving. They haven't, as I said, they're on the brink of revolution there. So we have a chance to do something about slavery, but it doesn't have to be done now. He begins to think about ways to ameliorate, to make slavery better, to make it okay. And of course, once he does that, then he's pretty much lost, right?
Yes, that's the short story of the long, sad story that follows. And that's right. So when he looks back, things look better and the family looks important. And this gets to a major theme of our book and the way we thought about Jefferson. And that is his idealization of the family is, despite the fact that he doesn't have one.
Yes, that's the interesting thing about it.
Yeah. so when he returns to Monticello, he's not returning to a nuclear family, but that's the ideal form for him. So instead, he recruits his daughters, or at least one of his daughters. I would have recruited both if he could have. He wants to attract people to Monticello. He has this idealized version of a life he could build for himself there, in which he wants Monroe and Madison to live in the neighborhood. He thinks this could be a marvelous way to have the best of both worlds, to bring European high civilization to America. And what bothers many Americans on the eve of the revolution is that it is a middling, boring world in which there isn't great wealth. And so therefore there isn't high civilization. And there's a lot of anxiety about, well, how could we ever match up to the metropolis? How could we ever become more like England? Because that's our model. And this idea that somehow our vices become our virtues, that is the broadly equal distribution of wealth. Well, that means that unlike France, where 19 out of 20 people have nothing, even if you include the enslaved people, you've got a majority of people who are more or less independent, who have therefore some agency, who can participate in government. It's this notion of an educable public. And maybe the most important thing, and you said this before about independence being the crucial thing for him, the revolution is the great defining moment of his life, is the mobilization of liberty-loving people to defend their rights against tyranny. That shows the enormous possibilities in the mass of the people. It's a kind of education through military and political mobilization. It is the way toward enlightenment. And it's tapping into what he sees and imagines as this upwelling of popular power. And maybe that goes back to the way he imagines the Declaration of Independence being written. You know how modest he is about it?
Yeah.
What, me? I didn't write the Declaration.
I didn't write it. Yeah.
No. It was like Shirley MacLaine. I was channeling the American people.
The American people.
Yes, and I was just the pen that came to hand, and through me. But this, and what that on the face of it sounds, of course, megalomaniac. That is, I am America. Jefferson has been confused with America. But I think he's on to something really important, and it's something that I think we've been nostalgic about ever since, is at least in his view, and historians will challenge this view, but in his view, the revolution is this wondrous mobilization of the people. That it's a movement. It's people coming together, dedicated to liberty, to preserving their farms and plantations, to protecting their families, and this idea of a movement, of a patriotic politics that brings people together. In many ways, I think it connects with what Scottish Enlightenment philosophers are telling Jefferson about the moral sense, about the capacity of ordinary people to rise to the occasion.
Yeah,
and that's.
I mean, it's something you were saying there that is key, and I wanted to bring it back to thinking about many things you said there are key, but about the book, and that is this notion that we wanted to try to get away from. Well, we see what you're doing, Jefferson, and we don't trust you, or we don't believe you.
Right.
Wanted to write the book from the perspective of what is this person thinking? I mean, what did he think he was doing? Not what we think he ought to have been doing, because there are plenty of things, obviously, that I think he ought to have been doing. But as a biographer, or, I don't want to include you in this, as people, or whatever it is that we're doing here together with this, is to think about what he thought he was doing. And all the things that you're saying there are his ideas, that we can sort of discern what his ideas are by the things that he's saying and by the things that he's doing. And it's writing a biography is sure, there's commentary about what the person is doing and the way you present the material very often. But it's really, for us, I mean, well, for both of us, was to try to take him at his word whenever it was possible to do. I mean, sometimes you can't do that, but for the most part, not to be in this constant interrogation saying, well, he said this, but he really didn't mean it. And I know that he didn't mean it because I don't think it makes any sense, which is not the way to think about other people's thoughts, right? Because it doesn't make sense to you. That's not what you would do. And that obviously means that he didn't take this seriously. You know, he took all of this stuff seriously. I mean, even crazy stuff. You know, everybody's going to be a Unitarian one day. I mean, I think
well, I was actually, once.
I know. You were once. You know, these are, for a person who thought that science was important and that, you know, stories, things were unfolding, knowledge was unfolding, he could sort of imagine, as we all often do, one day we will solve this particular problem. And then once that day comes, or people think it should have come, people look back and think, well, why would they have thought that happened, was going to happen? And there was never a chance for it. But in his thinking, having beat, you know, one of the most powerful countries in the world, having helped establish a republic, almost anything was possible. And so that's what he was going to go for, even if a lot of times it doesn't seem to make sense to us that could ever have been possible.
He did have an incredible faith in the people. And it wasn't just the people. In a way, Jefferson helped invent the very idea of the people. That's what the revolution represented, people coming together, becoming a people. And he imagined that every generation would be a new people. And that is, would then, the earth would belong to the living, and each generation would build on the foundations that previous generations had laid down. And this central idea, I think, is the one that we do feel some nostalgia for these days, is in these fractured, polarized days of ours now, where we doubt that we have the capacity to do anything about existential threats to our very existence. Well, imagine what it's like to break away from the British Empire in a dangerous world without any hope, without any expectation that there's going to be, well, God would have to be on our side. How else could we possibly triumph? But this idea of the nation or the people. And this is, I think, what's finally most important about Jefferson. He helps us understand the beginnings of national history, that collective story that we've been writing together, that's ours now. And we need to know where it started. And it didn't start in a very lovely place. It didn't start with people that we would want to know and live by their standards now. A lot of things have changed. It's a different world. But it's that connection that I think is really important. And Jefferson gets us there.
Yeah, and you have to, as you are suggesting here, take the bad with the good. You don't really understand that story if you don't add in, you know, indigenous people, slavery, all those kinds of things. The package together helps tell us why we are where we are now.
So I'd like to interrupt and go to some of the questions that we have. This has been just a wonderful conversation, but we have a lot of questions that the conversation has spurred. So if I can begin actually with a question about the collaborative writing process. So you engage with each other so well, and the questioner is asking, in this collaboration regarding this book, when you disagreed, how did you resolve the disagreements? Whose viewpoint won out?
Oh, I capitulated.
Oh, come on, I was going to say that. No. I would just say in passing, we wrote a lot of this book before we started writing it and before we knew we were going to write a book. And I'm reminded now, because I'm looking at a screen that's filled with Annette, And this is the way we talked about Jefferson for 4 or 5 year. Well, more than that, really.
Yeah.
We go back a long time. We didn't know we were going to do this book. I would say, in response to the question, it's incredible how little we disagreed about. There were moments. I came up with this cockamamie idea that Jefferson prayed, and what would I know as a lapsed Unitarian about prayer? But as I was working through the material, I came up with this idea, and Annette comes from much more serious religious tradition than I do, and she said, "You got to be kidding, big guy." So
no, but
that's about it.
No, but that's really about it. And I would have to say that I came over more to your side on that. That I think that I was being too provincial in my definition of Christianity, that people have different understandings about that. And so here was a disagreement where I was persuaded that his understanding about Jefferson's understanding about religion was right. We, as he said, we've known each other in 1995. We met, and we've been sort of in a constant conversation about Jefferson over the years. When we actually sat down to write, we would say, do you want to try this section? To try to keep people writing just a small section because if you write too much, you become wedded to what it is you're doing, and then show it to the other person, and he would rewrite me, I would rewrite him, and we just sort of go forward from that. Our editor wanted us to have a voice. I mean, sometimes when people do collaborations, one person will do a chapter and the other person will do the other chapter. We didn't really want to do that. We wanted a voice. So it's a work that has, all of the sentences have been mixed up. Half of a sentence might be his, the other half mine. And we sort of came to an end, towards the end, an understanding about how the book was supposed to sound. We worked in that way.
Gordon Wood says he can tell when I'm writing and when you're writing, but he's wrong.
No, he's wrong. And I think he is probably going, I would bet he's thinking about subject matter.
Yeah.
What's more likely the thing that I would be doing and the thing that Peter would be doing, but we were all of the map with that. So I think he might be surprised if we pointed to, when he tells us what he is that he thinks that you wrote and I wrote, he might be surprised to find out that he's wrong about that.
We also have a couple of questions about religious influences, since we're talking about religion. One asks about the use of the phrase, the beacon to the world, the vision of America as the beacon to the world, and how much that connects to the Puritan idea of the city on the hill. And there's another question asking about what the role of deism is in Jefferson's ideas about government.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could take the second. I don't think that Jefferson, I could do both of them. Jefferson was not the city. Well, I'll leave the city on the hill to Peter because he's from New England.
Well,
the deism.
That sermon wasn't known until the 19th.
I know it wasn't known at his time. He didn't know that, but I thought he meant maybe the concept of the idea of it. He wouldn't have known that part of it. The deism, he's often described as a deist because he believed in a God that put things in order. And then apparently deists did not believe that God intervened, but sometimes he sort of indicated that he thought that God did intervene. So he's he's a deist, but he had his moments, and I don't know whether it's the kind of people praying in a foxhole business or what, but he does invoke or think that God could intervene in certain areas. What do you think, Peter? So he's a deist, but there's a deist with a twist or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's right. But deism, we tend to think of it now critically as the arrogance of man putting himself in the place of God because we think we know it all. And that idea of us knowing it all now is much more plausible than it was then. We don't, incidentally, just in case you're wondering. But for somebody like Jefferson, who's an advocate of what he would have called natural religion, that is God's will and work must be known through his creation, and it must be lawful. That's not based on empirical observation. That's a faith. He has a faith in not that you could fully know and master the world, but that you could act in conformance with it. The genius of Republican government is that it comes closer to human nature, and therefore the role of humanity in nature, than any form of government which is based on divine right or some kind of watered down version of divine right. I think deism is really central, or what we now call deism is really central to that worldview. But it's a worldview that's full of awe and wonder. There are things that Jefferson doesn't understand, and maybe it could be understood one day. Why are there fossils in the high Andes, for instance? What are they doing there? Couldn't be the flood. He did some calculations. It doesn't work. So he's a man
What's
of
the
reason.
use of grief? Yeah, he's a man of reason.
Yeah.
So another question asks, this questioner is interested in your opinions on characterizations of Jefferson as a man with overly high expectations of the people around him. She mentions she's heard this discussed regarding his daughters, his grandchildren, as well as claims that he basically worked his proteges to death, like Meriwether Lewis and Francis Walker Gilmer, in creating the University of Virginia. And the question is, would you say that Jefferson had unrealistic expectations for both his family and his friends?
Well, that's one that always used to get my students upset back in the old days when I used to teach. In his letters to Patsy, to his daughter, which are essentially the anti-Mr. Rogers approach, which is, I don't love you just because you exist. Justify my love for you. I think the best answer to that is, yeah, he had high expectations. He was also deeply anxious about whether they would be fulfilled, and that includes everybody in his world. He can't control everything. He'd love to. He's the patriarch who imagines that he's in control of everything. But his, and Annette knows a lot more than I do, could speak more eloquently about it. The love that his daughters feel for him and his grandchildren feel for him is extraordinary. And it came out of just that kind of engagement. It's not the letters that we read out of context would lead you to think that he's a manipulative, is the word that comes to mind, that he's a sort of a monster trying to create these people in his own image. And you could say that he did pray that there would be a spread of the Enlightenment and that others would be like him in their engagement with the world. But of course.
Yeah. No, I would say he had high expectations for himself, and people who do that very often transfer that to other people. The daughter's letters, Peter's right. I mean, I think if you take them out of context, sometimes he does sound monstrous. I think we're talking about the letters that he's writing to Patsy when he's in various places, Philadelphia, Germantown, whatever, as the capital is moving around, and she's there in a boarding house. He's giving instructions, or even when he's in Paris, instructions about things to do, the way to do various things. And it just sounds to me like a person who has lost his wife and has young daughters, and he doesn't really know how to talk to them. I mean, I would imagine his wife had been the one, who was the primary caretaker of the kids, the primary, person in their lives. And he may have just come in, as his dad do, but then he's left to take care of them and he doesn't know what to say. By the time he gets granddaughters, the letters are very different. Mm-hmm. I mean, he still has exacting standards for them, but he knows how to talk to young people in a way that he didn't at the time. But he does have high standards for his proteges and people like that. And he had high standards for himself. I mean, a person who kept to the schedule that he kept, and, you know, writing everything down, taking the temperature, doing all kinds of amazing wind charts, you know, charts that show the strength of the wind. I mean, there's a lot going on there that I think, you know, if he suggested other people did a fraction of it, would be kind of crazy, actually. But I do think he sort of eased up on the young people as he got to be older.
I've always been struck by the story of when President Kennedy had a dinner for living American Nobel Prize winners, and the remark, I'm going to paraphrase, that he made at that dinner, that there is more brain power gathered in this room than at any time in the history of mankind, except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. I've always found that fascinating. So my question is, which of the 20th century presidents do you feel has been most influenced by Jefferson? Or there were several?
Well, the one who worshipped him the most was FDR.
Yeah.
FDR was the one who built the memorial. I mean, strangely enough, Mr. Big Government loved Jefferson. He had his vacation home at Kenwood, which was part of Jefferson's estate down in Virginia, in Charlottesville. He liked Jefferson's identification with the people. Obviously, Roosevelt, that was his big thing against the moneyed interests. I mean, in some ways, he was seen as a class traitor in the same way that Jefferson,
Similar.
among some people, was seen as a class traitor. So I would say FDR, he's the one who put him on the nickel, which is not worth much now, but it was a big deal then. And the you know, as I said, the Jefferson Monument. So FDR probably would be the person I would pick. What about you, Peter?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. And even the point on big government, if you take that notion of every generation having to reinvent America, and this is FDR identifying with the challenge of the day, Jefferson did not hesitate to exercise tremendous executive power beyond the bounds of the Constitution when the moment required it. Jefferson, when he talked about property and distribution, does acknowledge that there's nothing sacred about property. The only reason you don't have to redistribute it in 18th century, early 19th century America is it's already so broadly distributed. There's so much out there. But Jefferson did have a sense of the public good and the larger welfare and the uses of the state to promote that good. I don't think FDR was twisting that legacy. I think it was a heartfelt and honest effort to adapt the teachings of the first great American nationalist to the moment of crisis and the Depression.
When he was in Paris, of course, he writes to, he talks about quickly about FDR, Jefferson talks about redistribution of wealth, that after a certain point, people who made a certain amount of money should be taxed more than people who made less money, and people who made below a certain point shouldn't be taxed at all. So that's if Roosevelt saw that letter, he would have understood that that's sort of in line with his own philosophy as well.
Another questioner asks about Martha Jefferson, who seemed to have a unique and special bond with the Hemings. And this questioner asks, did Jefferson's daughters have the same relationships with the Hemings?
They had a special relationship with the Hemings because some of the Hemings people were her siblings, half siblings. They had the same father. Jefferson's daughters had female members of the Hemings family as ladies' maids or companions when they were children. Sally Hemings accompanied Jefferson's daughter, Mary, called Polly, and then Mariah, all these different names, to France. So they did have a close relationship with the Hemings family. Jefferson's wife and his daughters with his wife were connected to them that way.
And one final question from our viewers. This is a personal question asking if either or both of you collect $2 bills.
No.
You know, my mother, for some reason, when they came out, she got me about 5 of them, and they're stamped specially and everything. So, but that's the only way of collection that I ever did. You know, and it came from my mother. I don't know why she bought them for me, but she did.
Well, was it early influence? Really.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much, Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf, for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in. If you would like to view some of our previous episodes or learn more about the National Humanities Center mission or our programs, please go to nationalhumanitycenter.org. I'm Robert Newman. Thank you so much. Be safe and be well. Good night.